Good to have you back on Newsday. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has sacked chairman of his ruling Conservative Party over what he described as a serious breach of the ministerial code. Pressure had been building on Nadeem Zahawi amid allegations he settled a multi-million-dollar unpaid tax bill while he was in charge of the country's treasury. Now, in a letter to Zahawi, Sunak wrote he had been forced to act after promising at the start of his tenure that his government would have integrity, professionalism and accountability at every level. Zahawi, the founder of polling website YouGov, had acknowledged a dispute with tax authorities, but argued his error was careless and not deliberate. Rice correspondent Laurie Laird joins us now for more. Laurie, it's good to have you with us. The UK government...
Good afternoon.
Yeah, the UK government has lost yet another top official. Is this a surprise? If you remember, coming from the issues with Boris Johnson before now.
Yeah, I mean, you make a very good point there, Nii. But let's start. Was this a surprise? No, the only thing that was surprising was the timing. This came out just before 9 o'clock UK time this morning, which oddly is just about the time right before the main Sunday morning news program that everybody within Westminster watches, where a minister usually goes on a BBC program and has to explain what the UK government got up to last week, and those ministers have had a tough time lately. So the timing of this just before that program was a little bit suspicious, but I think everybody felt that Nadeem Zahawi was not going to be able to hang on. As you mentioned, he was forced to settle a tax dispute with the HMRC, the Inland Revenue, which is the tax authority here. The thing that makes this so even more egregious is that this settlement was being negotiated while Nadeem Zahawi was actually serving for a short period of time as what's called the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the finance minister here. That means he was negotiating with the Inland Revenue, the tax authority, which actually came under his department. So essentially, he was negotiating a tax irregularity with people who worked for him. So that makes this ever more egregious.
All right, Laurie, let's find out. What are the major complaints against Zahawi? You've mentioned some of them. What are the major complaints against him?
I mean, it relates to money that was held, and go back, as Nii mentioned, Zahawi is a very wealthy man. He founded the YouGov polling agency, he's thought to be worth more than £100 million. Oddly, that doesn't even make him the richest member of government, but let's get to that one in a few minutes. This relates to the holding company that the proceeds, the income from YouGov went into, held offshore. Apparently, some of that money came back onshore and may have not been taxed properly. So that was what the negotiation was over. Nadeem Zahawi said it was a careless error. The amount that he gave the Inland Revenue amounted to about £5 million. I'm careless with things as well, but careless over 5 million, kinds of difficult to excuse. So that is the main gist of what was negotiated. And of course, these things, it's never about the crime, is it? And I'm not saying he committed a crime. I'm using this jargonally. It's not about the crime. It's the cover-up. And what the problem was with this is Nadeem Zahawi did not declare that he was in discussions with the taxman while he was being considered and served as the nation's top finance minister. So it was a disclosure that actually got him rather than having to pay this back tax and a penalty.
Indeed, Laurie, despite this disclosure, has he responded so far?
His response is absolutely extraordinary, and this has only just come out in the past 30 minutes or so. He did put out a statement, did not mention the allegations or the finding by an independent ethics investigator that he did not declare these investigations properly. He took a real pop at the Fourth Estate. The Fourth Estate, I'm using his words. Essentially, that's us. That's journalists. In his statement, he was very, very critical of journalists who uncovered the this story in the first place. That has been his response throughout this investigation. He has accused the media of smearing him, and in his statement, almost no reference whatsoever to the findings that he broke the ministerial code, that he misled ministers.
All right, talk to us, Laurie. How does this affect the Prime Minister Rishi Sunak's ability to govern?
And I think that is the big story. And many of us in the media and further afield in politics have been wondering, why did Rishi Sunak, we're seeing him walking up to Downing Street right there, why did Rishi Sunak stick by Nadeem Zahawi for so long? Why didn't he fire him or at least suspend him on the spot once these allegations of tax irregularities came to light? No clear answers as to why he stood by the party chairman for a period of about 10 days or so. So it's not a surprise that he went, but it is a surprise that Rishi Sunak stood by him for this long. Certainly, Sunak has not made any progress or very little progress in trying to erase the almost the stench of sleaze that was with this government before he arrived, after his predecessor, Boris Johnson's various missteps when he was in government. And it's important for Rishi Sunak to be seen as cleaner than clean, for one reason, because he's following Boris Johnson, who had a more casual regard for protocols and following rules. The other thing that makes Rishi Sunak very, very vulnerable is, like Nadeem Zahawi, he also comes from an incredibly wealthy background. He is married to the child of one of India's richest men. Now, that's not to say that rich people shouldn't be in politics, but it does mean that these wealthier members of parliament need to be a little bit aware of how these actions reverberate with the greater electorate. And certainly, Rishi Sunak has been dogged by allegations that he is out of touch with people who are struggling here in the UK, particularly during a cost of living crisis. Inflation is very high here. And so Rishi Sunak is vulnerable to charges that he is not quite in touch with ordinary voters.
Indeed, Laurie. Now, is all of this a distraction from the Prime Minister's other responsibilities? I mean, we've seen strikes, which seem unabating so far.
Absolutely. It's such a good question. And I'm so glad that you mentioned the strikes, because that is one of the most important issues facing the UK now. We are seeing a degree of industrial unrest that we haven't seen in decades, and that is expected to get worse, particularly this week. Almost every public sector industry is walking off the job on the 1st of February. Rishi Sunak has tried to, sort of relaunch his premiership a little bit. He sent the current Chancellor of the Exchequer, Jeremy Hunt, out to do an economic speech last Friday. During that speech, there was not one mention of public sector workers and how the government intends to handle these strikes. For the most part, public sector workers are striking because their wages are not keeping up with inflation. Inflation here over 10%. I know that's only half as high as it is in Nigeria, but that's as high as it's been here in the UK in over 40 years. Public sector pay is rising by about 3%. That means anyone working in the public sector, and these are doctors, nurses, teachers, ambulance drivers, border control guards, they are all losing money once inflation is accounted for in their pay packet. So that is why we're seeing so much strike action. The government has said, we simply don't have the money to pay them. Really sorry, we appreciate the work that you do. We simply don't have the money. And this certainly, these distractions with Nadeem Zahawi, other things that are rumbling around the government right now. Rishi Sunak is struggling a little bit with the director of the BBC, appointed under Boris Johnson, but appointed under very dubious circumstances. That is distracting attention. And yes, it is very much preventing him from getting on the job. People see this. They see that Rishi Sunak, who protected his Chancellor Zahawi for a period of time, and they're thinking, well, wait a minute, I can't get on a train to get to work. Ambulance drivers are striking. What are the priorities of this government?
All right, still speaking about Rishi Sunak, talk to us. Isn't it all about that popular? Is it within his own party? Talk to us about his popularity right now, and will he survive the next election?
It does. It raises very many questions about his popularity and will he be able to survive to the next election? Remember, Rishi Sunak only became prime minister after Liz Truss, his immediate predecessor, was only in office for a very short period of time. She introduced a budget that essentially rocked the UK markets. Didn't get to stay in office for very long, but he was never the first choice of many people in the Conservative Party. And in fact, when he took the job, he's also almost been viewed as a caretaker. He's not popular amongst his MPs. His MPs still tend to be, at least the most vocal Conservative MPs, tend to be on the right side of the party. They would like to see tax cuts. They would like to see a more aggressive fiscal policy. They feel that if taxes are cut, that could somehow stimulate economic growth. They are critical of Sunak's policy of keeping a tighter hold on the government purse strings. And so he is an embattled figure within the Conservative Party. And I'm actually hearing rumors that Liz Truss, again, I mentioned she was only in power for a very short period of time, produced a budget that again rocked the financial markets here in the UK. She's gone very, very quiet, but we understand that she is about to come out of silence, perhaps this week, and to call for lower taxes ahead of an election that must be held by the beginning of 2025. Feeling is at this moment that Rishi Sunak, assuming that he stays in office, will extend the deadline for that, or will extend the length of time before that election for as long as possible to try and get some degree of popularity back for the Conservatives. Right now, they're trailing the Labour Party by in excess of 20 percentage points.
Indeed, and we also have to remember that the Prime Minister doesn't have a popular mandate via a general election, which is what everyone is anticipating right now. And all of this is happening while the UK economy is slowing. What can the government do at this rate?
Not a great deal. I mean, the government has promised, and Jeremy Hunt, again, the current chancellor, came out, gave a speech on Friday that, as I said, did not mention public sector pay. The centerpiece of that seemed to be, we are going to bring inflation down by about 5 percentage points by the end of the year. That seems to be the government's economic policy. Here's the thing. Statistically, inflation was probably going to come down of its own accord, simply because oil prices are not energy prices. Remember, we saw that massive spike in energy prices about a year ago, or just short of a year ago, after Putin's invasion of Ukraine. Those sorts of big jumps in energy prices will jump out of the numbers when we compare year on year over the next couple of months. So statistically, inflation is going to come down of its own accord. So it's one thing the government can say, look, we said we'd cut inflation. We have cut inflation, but inflation is more than likely going to come down regardless of what the government does. As for other growth plans, this is very, very unclear. Jeremy Hunt, the chancellor, last week talked about making more opportunity of Brexit, somehow using that as an engine of growth. But most business leaders are frustrated by Brexit. They are not seeing any opportunity in Brexit. What they are saying is Brexit has made trade so much more difficult for us. And that's very important for a small, open economy like the UK, which relies on trade for about a third of its economy. So more difficult trading relations with the EU have made things worse, and these sort of unheralded opportunities of Brexit. Rishi Sunak says, Jeremy Hunt says, we'll take advantage of those. They haven't articulated exactly what those plans are.
Indeed, Laurie. And finally, briefly, please, I'd like to take you back to Zahawi's polling website, YouGov. Will his sacking have any impact on the site's fortune, you think? It's all about trust here.
It's an excellent question. And while he hasn't been directly associated with YouGov for some time, it's been more of a silent holding. And in fact, he says that the founding shares of YouGov are actually in the name of his father, a company controlled by his father. So he hasn't been associated with that company for quite some time. But you're right to say, particularly over past years, and in the UK as well, where pollsters have got things very, very wrong. Polling is an industry that does, to a certain extent, rely on trust. But I'm not sure that Zahawi's current problems will affect the fortunes of YouGov.
All right, I want to say many thanks to you, Laurie Led, our ICE correspondent.